So in terms of strategies for exiting violence, so the first point we would say is that we need to recognize that the significance of the politics of gender, so the politics of gender refers to, the contestations around gender norms, gender relations. These can be used as a litmus test for the kind of regime and governance we are dealing with. So if you really want to understand different transforming regimes in terms of authoritarianism, in terms of democratization, we really have to look at the specific politics of gender and the dialectics between the two. Secondly, discussions about violence, all forms of violence, not just gender-based violence, whether sectarian violence, ethnic violence, political violence, or violence based on contestations over economic resources, should not be gender blind. And the gender analysis should cut across, as Michelle was saying, all analysis. And if we acknowledge the existence of a continuum of violence, then we need to expand our conceptualization of violence is, what violence actually is. And we should include all forms of physical, verbal, symbolic, but also structural violence. And if we do that, and if we want to think about strategies for exiting violence, then we need to recognize that the strategies for exiting violence must include supporting those women and men who are working on the wider spectrum of mobilizing for gender-based equality and justice. Fourthly, we have to involve women in decision-making processes. And I should add also in knowledge production and policy making, and I'm very grateful that I was added to the panel. But we need to be smarter than a mere add women and stir, because on the one hand, clearly it is not acceptable that Syrian women are not involved in official peace talks. But if we were just to add a few token women, that might not necessarily make a big difference in terms of the conversation around the table. Quotas are problematic if they're the only measure. Iraq is the best example. There is a 25% quota enshrined in the constitution, but it often means is that it's the wives, daughters, sisters of conservative politicians who are in parliament, sometimes actually under pressure from their male counterparts, sometimes actually arguing, as recently we had one woman who was arguing for polygamy and against monogamy. So quotas in and of itself do not do the trick. It has to be a more holistic approach. I found, again, that in the Kurdish political movement, where you have a situation, both the Kurdish political movement linked to the PKK in Turkey, but also the PYD in northern Syria, that all leadership positions need to be shared between a man and a woman. But also there's sort of an attempt to really put gender justice at the center of all political decision making. Now, while we should not glorify women fighters and fetishize them, as seems to be happening, as I said before, in the case of the Kurdish woman fighting Daesh, I think we have to acknowledge that in certain situations, so in situations of extreme sectarian violence, in other situations of extreme violence, that maybe armed resistance and struggle might be the only way to prevent more atrocious violence, particularly gender-based violence. And I think that's something that's very controversial, but I think we need to talk about it. And lastly, I would say that foreign policy and discourse is important. I don't know if, many of you will be aware that the impact that the so-called post 9/11 clash of civilization discourse in terms of we will liberate your women and as part of democratizing you and bringing human rights, we will liberate your women, that this had the greatest negative impact on women's rights, activism and mobilization in the Middle East. So that many people who maybe under different circumstances would not have been opposed to many issues around, women's education, political participation, and so on, because it was linked to, armed intervention, to neoliberal economics, and so on. There is this huge backlash in the region. Now, as I said before, I'm not one of those people who thinks that we can explain everything away by either the military interventions or so-called imperialism more broadly. But I think we would be denying the impact that what is happening in New York, in Paris, or in London in terms of the discourse has either on populations in Europe and the US, but also in the Middle East.